had to refuse you.
Well, you are my commanding officer.
Well?
Can I have a week's leave to recuperate, sir?
Certainly not.
Thank you, sir.
New from BBC Video, the Blackadder dynasty continues its passage through history.
I heard quite an amusing story myself the other day.
Oh, good.
Rick Mail is Kevin Turvey, the ultimate investigator.
If there's anything you want investigating, Kevin's here.
And BBC Video presents The Young Ones.
What is that little white dot?
It means something really heavy. It means there's no more telly.
A comic collection, out now on BBC Video.
And it's comedy over on BBC2 in 10 minutes with Mel Smith and Griff Rhys-Jones in the first of 4 small doses, beginning with a short story by Graham Garden, The Whole Hog. Here on 1 in an hour from now, Chris becomes obsessed with the idea of catching the grandest jewel thief in Cagney and Lacey. Now we join Peter Sissons and his guests for Question Time.
Good evening and welcome to Question Time, an hour of debate and argument before a cross-section of the public on matters which they find of interest and concern. Around the table with me tonight are the Right Honourable Linda Chalker MP, who is one of only 2 women Privy Councillors in the House of Commons, and we all know who the other one is. Until the summer reshuffle, she was the Deputy Foreign Secretary, but is now the Minister for Overseas Development. Linda Chalker is a down-to-earth workaholic whose advancement under Mrs Thatcher has stopped short of the Cabinet, to the puzzlement of many of her colleagues. Paul Boateng MP is a Labour backbencher who entered Parliament at the last election declaring Brent South today, Soweto tomorrow. Half Ghanaian and half Scottish, he studied law at Bristol University and lists his clubs as 2 notorious cafes there. Controversy followed him as chairman of the GLC's police committee and still does in his work on race and police matters as a solicitor. It has been observed that his humour and wit deflects much of the routine criticism aimed at the hard left. Jonathan Porritt is director of one of the most influential environmental pressure groups, Friends of the Earth. He's a former chairman of the Ecology Party, which later became the Green Party. He's still a member of the Green Party, but recently read them a stern lecture on the realities of political life. He said he is determined to destroy the image of environmentalists as woolly-hatted, woolly-minded lentil stirrers. Anne Leslie is a veteran reporter and columnist with the Daily Mail, the length of her fingernails matched only by the sharpness of her pen. My personal recollection of her concerns the time she was commissioned by another organisation with which I was associated to make a film report on the Aldermaston March. In her closing address to the camera, she accused a group of women taking part, to their faces, of living in the land of Tinkerbell. She finished in 1 take, despite being heckled throughout by the said women with constant cries of cow. They're here to answer your questions, the first of which is from Natasha Coward, who is a student.
What steps do the panel feel should be taken to ensure that the injustice of the imprisonment of the Guildford IV doesn't happen again?
Paul Boateng.
It was, at the very least, a gross injustice. At the worst, it was a wicked criminal conspiracy to pervert the course of justice and then indeed subsequently to cover that up. And I think what we have to do is to avoid a situation in which once again we either blame junior officers or a dead director of public prosecutions, because it's easy to do that. And what we have to do is to look and see what this tells us about our whole system of criminal justice. And I think we need to look at the way that it took 15 years for this ultimately to be rectified, the injustice that was done. And we need to get our appeal system right and, I think, have a new body other than the Court of Appeal that's going to be responsible for actually investigating cases of miscarriage of justice, because this is only one of several. So that needs to be done. Then I think also we've got to examine very closely how it is that this sort of thing is unlikely to happen, say in Scotland, where you have someone other than a police officer responsible for actually carrying out or supervising the initial investigation. So it's not possible in Scotland for someone to be convicted on their own uncorroborated evidence. We need to have a procurator fiscal type system, or at least to require that there be some other supportive evidence other than a confession. So those things need to be done. And the sad thing is that the Home Secretary in his statement to the House today didn't seem to be giving an indication that there would be a full-scale judicial inquiry with the power to make those recommendations. We need to do it, we must do it, because there mustn't be a repetition of this if we're to maintain confidence. He said there would be a judicial inquiry, but what he didn't say was that that judicial inquiry would have the right to recommend these major reforms in the law. And it's major, and indeed, in my view, radical reforms that we need, not just blaming a few people who are either too junior to make any real difference or too dead, really, to be brought to justice.
Linda Chalker.
Well, first of all, I think it is a terrible thing, and it's quite right that the Home Secretary announced today that compensation would be paid, but no compensation will make up for all the years those innocent people have actually spent in jail. The judicial inquiry under Sir John May, I believe, does have the freedom to make recommendations to the Home Secretary, and from everything I've heard Douglas Hurd say, I know it would be his wish that the best advice is given to him. I can make a point about the 14 years, 15 years on. It was, of course, only last year that new evidence came forward, and no Home Secretary has the right to judge for himself on the basis of evidence that's been through the court and have been through the legal system. It was when the new evidence came forward, the Home Secretary was able in January this year to put it to the Court of Appeal, and that has been the result. There are still inquiries going on, and there will be most thorough investigations. The Avon and Somerset Police have done an excellent job, and they will continue their work, and other inquiries are going on at the same time.
But we're looking at this 14 years in jail for innocent people. How much of the delay in reopening the case, which people have tried to do from time to time, has been due, if you like, to the establishment closing ranks, a reluctance to reopen it for fear of the damage it may do?
No, I don't think there was a reluctance. That was the point I was seeking to make. Douglas Hurd doesn't have a right, on the basis of the evidence in his judgment, to reopen it. It was the new evidence that came forward last year which enabled him to go to the Court of Appeal and to have this thoroughly investigated. Now, there have been a lot of very notable people who have sought to get this reopened, but until that evidence came forward, he had no grounds on which to do it. And I think there's one other thing. I think now that we have the safeguards in the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, the safeguards which insists that there is a custody officer who has to make a custody report on the suspect, and that person is totally separate from the investigation, I believe that that is a good thing. And the second thing
you're saying that this couldn't have happened?
I don't believe it.
If the present act had been enforced then?
That's right. And the second thing, well,
Linda, because the fact of the matter is that we know, because already in Birmingham, in Manchester, in Kent, it has been shown that police officers are prepared to lie. They have lied in the past, and this case is a quite clear evidence of that, and there's scope, even with the Criminal Justice Act, Police and Criminal Evidence Act, for them to lie again. It happens all the time.
But this is the point, Paul. If they lie, they are going to be found out. And the whole point of putting the safeguards, they must be found out. And that is exactly what I hope Sir John May, in his report, will actually strengthen the investigation, the sort of investigations that are going on at the moment. But we have built in safeguards, and I believe you actually do agree with me that they're safeguards, and giving the suspect the right to inform that he is being held and a right to a solicitor now is absolutely fundamental, and it's a pity it took quite so long for that to come in, and I fully accept that. But those police officers who, if they were responsible for this terrible miscarriage of justice, have got to be brought to justice themselves.
Let's leave that for a moment. Jonathan Porritt.
To pick up on that final point, I mean, obviously we must never assume that it's just the ranks that are responsible for this kind of miscarriage of justice. It is, as we've already heard, essentially the officers who condone that kind of behaviour amongst those with whom they're working. And it is those against whom the law must now be directed in terms of working out who is responsible for this miscarriage. And I think that is a critically important thing, that any inquiry must now follow through right to the end, even if it is right up to the top of that particular tree. I think that the question about what happens in Scotland and doesn't happen here is crucially important. Uncorroborated evidence is obviously very flawed indeed, and I would have thought we've learnt enough now in many instances to ensure that that is cleared up through the kind of legal reform that Paul was talking about. And I also think it's very important that the role of the Court of Appeal is actually examined closely. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know whether or not it is capable to change the remit of the Court of Appeal in such a way that they can actually deal with these miscarriages of justice, rather than merely look at legal technicalities. I would have thought that that was possible, but if it isn't possible, then we do indeed need another body. But at the end of the day, one has to remember that this miscarriage has been revealed by an extraordinary combination of the British establishment, as it were, bishops and ex-Home Secretaries and journalists and extraordinarily brave campaigners who for many, many years have gone on saying, this is wrong, we must do something about it. And I suspect that even if we get all these reforms in place, we will still need an attitude which says the judicial system must be kept under the closest scrutiny. Because we have a major problem still, unless every single serving member of the police force in this country understands that any act of dishonesty or mendacity puts at risk the service they offer to this country, then we will constantly need a whole battery of watchdogs and pressure groups to make certain that they are exposed to that kind of scrutiny. And that is really comes right back down to police training and why it is that so many people involved in the pursuit and the exercise of law still think they can better represent our interests by actually lying rather than telling the truth at every turn.
Thank you very much.
And Leslie.
Well, I'll just say I endorse what has been said about uncorroborated confessions should not be acceptable, and that perhaps something in the Scottish system should be adopted here. I'm also very attracted towards the legal reform group Justice's idea that there should be an independent body which can investigate cases where there is a strong suspicion of a miscarriage of justice, because of course the Court of Appeal's remit is far too narrow. But I think Linda earlier was saying that she didn't think it was the establishment kind of resisting the resolving of this case and the exposure of the justice. I think there is that feeling in the establishment. It was most openly stated by Lord Denning, who tends to openly state more or less everything he thinks, and that's very useful. But he said that he didn't like investigative journalism going into cases because he felt that this would destroy confidence in the system. And when asked whether, even if this involved the rights of individuals to get justice perhaps being trampled on, he said yes, he felt confidence in the system was the most important thing. Now, I think you can only have true confidence in the system if it's not a con trick, if we really believe that the evidence was just, that the police were not bent. And I think, therefore, nobody should say, don't interfere, don't pressure when you think there is a case of injustice, because we can only believe in our justice system if we have it proved to us that it is not on the side of the establishment and against justice itself. And the final thing I may say is, thank goodness we didn't have the death penalty, because now we'd be saying, oh, isn't it sad that we executed them all those years ago? Isn't it sad? It would be rather like the IRA, who tends to apologise for its mistakes after it's blown somebody to bits and say, oh, we are sorry, it was a mistake, but too bad. I'm glad